Hello, everybody, and welcome to Live with the Pricing Lady. I am Janine Liston, your hostess, and this show is all about helping you understand the tactics and strategies in pricing so you can confidently go out in the world, charge for the value you deliver, and spend more time bringing great value to your customers. Today, I am super excited to have a very special guest on the show. We're going to do a little bit of a different format. But I have with me Ruchira Neotia. She is going to share with us some of the behind the scenes of pricing in the wine and spirits industry. Welcome, Ruchira.
Thank you, Jane. I am absolutely chuffed. This is such an interesting topic and an interesting audience. You know, we all love the drink, but there's a lot that's behind it.
Yes. Yes. I was telling Ruchira just before we got on here that I didn't have time to go get a bottle of wine because my intention was to have a glass of wine here with me. You're more prepared than I. So why don't we get started with a couple rapid fire questions? First of all, where are you joining us from today?
I'm in London today.
In London. Excellent.
Yes.
And what would you describe as, oh, sorry.
I said England, not Canada.
Oh, is there a London? Oh, yeah, there is a London in Canada. That's true.
Sorry.
No problem. How would you describe your superpower?
Well, alcohol is my passion. So I have a pretty intuitive and informed palate. I can match a relevant drink to anything. This includes my book club. So I told people, even if you set a book in Mars, I can pair a drink to that. So yeah, that's my superpower.
Wow, that's amazing. I always find it really interesting when people can taste and smell things at a level other people can't. Okay, hold on a moment. My apologies. I'm not sure what's beeping because my phone is off, but something is. I don't know if you guys hear it, but anyhow, so let me continue. What's the one interesting thing that most people don't know about you that you'd like to share with us?
Ooh. I once co-piloted a plane from London to Duxford Airfield Museum wearing a Chewbacca mask. I'm a big Star Wars fan, and I was training for a private pilot's license.
Okay. I was going to say there's a whole lot to unpack in that one short statement. Why?
He was the best co-pilot in the history of time. I mean, come on, Chewbacca. If I was going to be an effective co-pilot, yeah.
Oh, that's funny. Okay. Now, why don't you share with us a little bit about what your business offers and what you do?
So I'm a wine spirits and sake consultant. So I'm an ex-CMO. So what I think I bring to the table, aside from my understanding, my news in the alcohol industry, is really sort of tailoring my offerings to the person, the client, and the business objectives. And it's not just about the product and my knowledge and my own arrogance or hubris. So, for example, I design drinks lists for restaurants, and they end up sort of achieving 2-3x in beverage sales because of the perfect fit between food and wine and spirits, as the case might be. And then again, creating incredibly entertaining experiences for corporate tastings, private events. But just, if you want to build a cellar, if you want to, run an amazing event, virtually or otherwise, or if you've got a great restaurant who kind of needs somebody to help them with their offerings, I'm the person to talk to.
Okay. Excellent. And how did you get into this?
It's one of those weird things in life. I've been a bit of a nerd with alcohol, so I've done every qualification there was, and it is pretty tough, right? So when you're holding down a full-on corporate job and reorchestrating orgs, and then you sort of lean too far into your hobby, and then you sort of fall into it, and that's what happened to me. And once I got a taste of this earlier this year, it was a little hard to sort of extract myself, and I'm kind of giving myself a run at it. So this is how I ended up falling into this industry.
Okay.
Leaned too far into my hobby.
Well, that's great. I mean, most people would love to have a job that is something that they're that passionate about and love that much. So congratulations on being able to achieve that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So I'd like to start this conversation because there's a lot that goes into getting to the final price that you pay for a bottle of wine or gin or whatever it is. So
Mm.
can you tell us a little bit about, what that process looks like and how that might influence the pricing that we see in the end? Yeah.
So here's the thing, right? So before I got into this industry, we all have like a very romantic idea about a drink. We all lap it up, the great advertising, it's the lifestyle. It's a very romantic idea. It is bloody hard work. I mean, it's like blood, sweat, and tears. So when you're sort of looking at the cost journey, there is a whole heap of factors, right? But the biggest price point in any bottle is actually the tax man. So when you're sort of looking at a bottle of wine, at the very, so UK is a very price sensitive market. So when you're looking at a price point on a wine, so like say, £5.50 in a supermarket, about 60% of that is tax. Duty is £2.67. That's flat.
No.
And then on top of that, you have 20% VAT. Then you've sort of got, your labeling cost, your bottle. So bottle glass became extremely expensive, post COVID, and there was a real sort of glass shortage, so 40% more expensive, right? So then you just look at a glass bottle, the price for that, the labeling, transport and handling, depending on how the wine was made, whether it was stored. A single barrel, just
Mhm.
an empty wooden French barrel, costs 700 to 800 euros.
Right.
And that contains about, 200 bottles worth of wine.
Mhm.
And then you sort of have transport and logistics. Then you've sort of got your supermarket or your retailers or your
Mhm.
trade restaurants margins. So let's, since we're talking about supermarket example, I'm going to give you a very, very tactical example here. I'm going to run some math, right? £5.50. 2.67 duty, 20% VAT is about, I think, circa 92 pence. So that is over 60% of your costs. Packaging, as I
Mhm.
discussed, close to £1. Then let's say logistics is about 0.30. And then if we're kind of assuming the retailer's margin between 20 to 30%, it's like 80 pence. So there's 21 pence worth of wine in a bottle that you pick up that's £5.50.
Wow, that's incredible, right? I mean, that's mind-blowing, and I
Yeah.
think at least, we're talking about if we're looking at the costs here, right? The costs
Mm,
involved in
mm,
producing it.
mm,
And I think, a lot of people, I always joke with my clients that, when they're focused on the cost of things as the basis, the sole
mm.
basis for what they charge, we always joke about that, that's not what the customer is paying attention to. Yeah, and
Yeah.
that when they're making a purchase, they're paying attention to what they think they're gonna get out of it, but they're not necessarily paying attention to they're not calculating the cost to produce it and bring it to you. If
Yeah.
they were, it would take them a long time to purchase every little thing they buy, right? So it's really important here for people to, I think, to realize that
Mm.
the cost is an important part of understanding what to charge because you need to understand how profitable you can be and whether or not that's profitable enough for your business. But the fact that 20 pence or 40 pence,
2021 pence in a
2021 out of a
yeah,
5 pound,
50.
approximately 5 pound bottle of wine, that's like peanuts.
What's interesting is as you start sort of going up in the scale just a tiny bit,
Mhm.
that ratio starts to exponentially increase. And
Yeah.
specifically for the wine, right? Because some things will stay the same. So the duty is flat, the
Mhm.
VAT will shift.
Mhm.
Transport will relatively be the same, packaging, más o menos a little bit. But so say if you're looking at a 10 quid bottle of wine, you kind of end up with about £2 worth of wine in that instead
Right.
of 21 pence. So it's just costing you double. The quality of wine you're getting is 10x. Then when
Right.
you're sort of going to £20, the quality of wine you end up getting in the bottle is worth about 31 times more.
Okay.
And the increased cost is 4x. So it
Right.
is a very disproportionate increase. So I
Right.
think every pound that you spend from £8 to especially £20,
Uh-huh.
it kind of goes exponentially towards the quality of the wine in your bottle. Now, again,
Mm.
there are other factors at play, but this is a very good general rule of thumb.
Mhm.
I'm not talking about affordability here, so we're not going
Right.
to get into whether a person can afford £5.50 or 20. I'm kind of
Right.
talking about the value if you're really kind of looking for value for money. Now,
Mhm.
after this particular threshold, obviously, things start to shift a bit because brand comes into play, how you're making certain
Mhm.
things, and then there is, how long is a piece of string. But I would probably say the biggest aha moment for anybody thinking about wine is, by and large, if you can afford a bottle of wine that costs £12, you can afford a bottle of wine that costs £15. But that extra £3 that you pay in that is probably going to go pretty much all against the quality of the wine in the bottle.
Interesting.
So
Interesting. And is that true for wines that come more or less from anywhere globally, or is there a different geographically?
Transport can get quite interesting, right? So it
Mhm.
can get quite complicated, but generally when people are importing, um, you end up importing in sufficient quantity in bulk. So you kind of do the math on that to keep that relatively stable. So
Mhm.
yes, there should be a little bit of a differential, but it's actually more on import duty that
Mhm.
makes a huge difference
Okay.
between where you're importing from. Because, for example, American wine is so expensive in America that you will see that in the UK, you find very few instances of that
Mhm.
on basic shelves, maybe very at the top end, but even there it's a little bit lower because our duty relationships are much harder there.
Mhm.
Whereas with when we were part of the EU, when pre-Brexit, that was a very different ball game because you could literally be importing from anywhere in the EU, which was very, very different.
Mhm.
Um, then there's labor costs, right? So, for
Right.
example, why is South African wine such great
Mm.
value for money? And again, I'm taking into consideration vineyards where people are still paid decently, but labor is cheap.
Mhm.
So the quality ratio to that versus producing wine
Mm.
in the UK, for example, like British wine can never be cheap because
Right.
it's really expensive to produce it here. Your costs, just everything is X
Right.
X X X
Right.
X. So
Right.
you would think, right, going to go buy a bottle of wine down my country lane in Sussex or something like that. I'm in London, but if I was in the country,
Mhm.
you would still kind of buy a more inexpensive bottle of wine from South
Right.
Africa or from Chile because it's the volumes that sort of offset it.
Right, right, right. Oh, that's interesting. So, in my earlier days, I worked for a company who was in agriculture.
Mhm,
And one of the things that we did was we went and visited wine producers and Prosecco producers in Italy. And I
mhm,
remember being the wine producer, well, one of them that we visited, it was very specific of the Amarone wine,
mhm, mhm.
which is a lovely red wine. I love it. It's so nice. Yeah, but
Oh,
it's produced in a very particular way.
yep.
And I would guess that that also has an influence, um, on not just on the price, but then also on the quality of the wine.
Oh,
That
absolutely. I mean, to make an Amarone is a multi-step process
Mhm,
because, first of all, just in general, I think the one thing that people kind of need to bear in mind when it comes to wine, it's an agricultural product.
mhm.
So, grapes are grapes. You can't manufacture them; like they have to grow, and it's beholden to the vagaries of nature.
Right, and it takes when someone starts a vineyard, my understanding is it takes 7 years before
Yeah,
you have the first usable crop,
yeah.
right? So, which is also
There are
really
rules in certain regions
yeah.
that will not allow you to do anything before, you
Mhm.
can go make cheap brandy with it, but that's about it. Yeah. So it
Right.
takes about minimum 7 years before you can
Mhm.
establish a vineyard. And then after 20 years, the yield per vine starts to lower because the vines are getting older. Fruit is concentrated,
Mm.
yes. But, again, when you're sort of thinking about the costs here, there's a lot that goes into the
Right.
bottle. Then when you use the example of Amarone, my God, delightful wine. But I'll just give you an example of how much work
Mhm.
that goes into to that. You just, with traditional wines, you pick the wines, sorry, you pick the grapes, uh, choose to destem, not crush
Mhm.
it, press it, ferment it, either store it or bottle it straight, depending on
Mhm.
how you want to sort of, run with it. With Amarone, there is no cutting corners. To call it an Amarone, you have to dry the grapes. Some
Mhm.
people choose to dry it like, they chop it up, dry it on the, so the grapes have to be raisined.
Mhm.
And then you have to crush the raisins because you can't press them because there's no real juice. And they
Mhm.
have dried in rooms to kind of make that happen. There's
Exactly.
specialized rooms. Then you take these crushed grapes and soak it in some new wine that was made with some of the grapes. And then you kind of, you have to age them in certain barrels.
Right.
I mean, it is a romantic process. You see it in the kind of grapes. It is
Yeah.
magical, but
Yeah.
it is very hard work. And then you sort of go, well, I want an Amarone for £5. I mean, like, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
somebody's not getting paid, and
Yeah.
that probably isn't Amarone in your bottle.
Yeah. And I
Um,
think that that's a good point, that there's a lot that goes behind your everyday wines, but a lot
yeah,
of times, not always, but many times for the more expensive wines,
yeah,
there's something very particular that's going on that
yeah.
impacts it even more. But what's interesting, if it's only, a few pounds of the total, then I would guess also a lot of what people are paying for is more perceived value in the wines. Is that also
That is correct.
true?
And I think
Yeah.
especially after a certain price point,
Yeah.
because the market is very competitive in
Mhm.
between 10 and 20 quid. But after that, if you want the customer's dollars or pounds, as we're in this
Right.
country, it's about the brand. So
Mhm.
even, for example, when you get into the wine industry, and I find this amazing little producer in let's go with that, an Amarone producer in Italy who's making literally like 200 bottles of wine. Now, to import that, just that small, tiny quantity, is going to cost me a fortune
Right.
because it doesn't sort of take into account shipping, volumes, etc. And then if the producer is completely unknown, it costs this producer quite a lot of money to make that wine,
Mhm.
but nobody in the UK knows about it. So if I go sell that to a
Mm.
restaurant, the restaurant guy is like, you're my friend, Ruchira, I love you, and I know you have great taste, but you're trying to sell me this bottle of wine that nobody's ever heard of. I know it tastes good, but it costs £40. So that means I'll have to put it on the list. Traditionally in the UK, it'll be
Right.
3x, so at £120.
Mhm.
And it's like, there is a very known producer making great wine, much larger quantity, which I'm able to get at £25. So how do I justify that, right? So it's quite complex. And
Mhm.
and then brand will play a huge amount. So initially, when somebody's entering a market like the UK, I'd always tell them that, because it's a price sensitive market, think about establishing and investing in your brand
Mhm.
first, getting yourself known, become covetable. And this is specifically at the top end. I'm not talking about, the value wines here.
Mhm.
And that's when you sort of tap into this cultish behavior and people who are crazy about a particular flavor, and that you can
Mhm.
detect. These would be collectors like me, people who can sort of probably where the money is, in a way is worth it because you can make out the difference between said
Right.
one. And then you're just like, because I want to have X wine because I know it's going to taste
Mhm.
like this. And it's impossible to get my hands on it. I'm obsessing over it. I will spend £100, like no bother, because that's my producer. And
Right.
it becomes emotional.
Yeah.
So at the top end, it's like, when you sort of start crossing that 20 quid threshold and starting to go up, there is an emotional price. Before that, it's a
Mhm.
functional price. After that,
Right.
it's an emotional price, which works, I think, very similar to products in the luxury industry.
Mhm. Mhm. Interesting. So I'm curious because you said something in there and kind of ran by it. So you said, like for a restaurant, they're
Mhm.
going to pay a certain amount to get that wine, and then they're
Yeah,
going to put it on their price list at somewhere else. Can you
yeah.
share a little bit more with us about, what goes into that thinking
Yeah.
because
So,
I mean, most of us, when we look at a wine list, we're
mhm.
like, well, we don't want to pay the most expensive. We don't want to pay the lowest, so we'll take the thing in the middle, right?
So you know what? I will say this. This is something I think the trends are starting to change, but I
Mhm.
respect how the majority of Europe handles pricing in restaurants,
Mhm.
specifically France, specifically Austria,
Mhm.
and maybe Germany, but let's kind of stick with France, Austria, Germany, Italy, Spain,
Mhm.
these guys. Over there, they tend to sort of balance out the margins the way they sort of price the food in a restaurant. So, people who are having a good eating experience are going to have a good drinking experience. You sort of
Mhm.
get more value for money. Now, for whatever reason in the UK, and this sort of, goes back a ways, and I don't know how long back to, but general rule of thumb, at least in the United Kingdom, is retail price
Mhm.
times 3x.
Okay.
So if you're able to buy a bottle of wine for 20 pounds in a wine shop,
Yeah.
and if you find that in a restaurant, chances are it'll be listed for 60 pounds.
Okay. Wow.
It's just
The
the
rule
way.
of thumb.
So then you start to kind of go, and then what happens is at the cheaper end, the margin will be even higher.
Mhm.
And at the
Yeah.
more expensive end, they do sort of tend to shrink it a bit.
Yeah.
Now, personally, I disagree with this. And I
Mhm.
think there is a
Why?
movement now, because when you start thinking about it, you go to great fine dining restaurants and then you're starting to make decisions. You know, you're eating great food. You made the decision, I'm going to go in, I'm going to spend X amount of money on food. I'm going to have like some great
Mhm.
experiences. Then when you start looking at the drinks list, and then you start to make, the exact thing that you said, don't want to buy the most expensive, don't want to buy the cheapest. But
Mhm.
then you start to value your list on the basis of
A
price,
price. Yeah.
because
Mhm.
you're kind of thinking, where am I not getting short circuited here, right?
Right. Right.
And that's, I think, what needs to shift, because you don't look at that and think about that when you're looking at the food.
Mhm.
You're not trying to, look at that and where is that margin. So I think to kind of bring that closer and work more on volume, because in the UK, they tend to shift more wine at the cheaper ends, making higher margins.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
than they do in the more expensive wines. But then I think, it ends up in many instances creating a lack of balance between the quality of food you're eating and then the quality of the
Quality.
wine, or the alcohol you're sort of consuming along with that.
Mhm.
What I did
Mhm.
with my restaurant, and I think I have to say I'm a bit more inspired by Europe in that, when I was asked to sort of design the drinks experience for Darjeeling Express, Ozma
Mhm.
Khan's task for this restaurant, all-female kitchen, the only one of its kind in the world. They're not trained chefs, they're housewives. And
Hmm.
she's like a global superstar. She's on Netflix, first British chef to be featured on Netflix's Chef's Table.
Okay.
And so I said, I want to bring, she's very generous with the ethos of her dining. So I said, the way I want to price it is, I'm actually going to put everything by the glass. You get decent margins there, but people have a great choice. But it's going to be a tight, condensed list. Now, instead of creating a compendium, because
Mhm.
that's, all you end up being is like you're sitting with friends. You don't want to go through an entire Bible. And I'm a wine nerd. Even I'm not going to do that. I'm like, where's the psalm? I need recommendations here. You're in a restaurant with no psalms and I want to
Yeah.
interact with people. I want people to have done the work and
Right.
help make a tighter selection. So
Mhm.
you have a tighter selection that allows you to have better bargaining, I wouldn't say bargaining power, but you're able to kind of avail of more volume pricing from your wholesaler. And then when you're selling more of the good stuff, even if it's a lower margin, so my margins are much lower, they're up to like 1.75 to 2x maximum. Um, I end up selling more of the better stuff, giving people a better experience. So you end up actually increasing your beverage sales by 3x for the entire restaurant. Because what happens is, just in this instance, let's say if my cheapest wine, I'm buying it for £10, I've listed it on the restaurant, I'm making it up, like, traditionally anybody would have done that.
Mhm.
They've listed it for 40. That's not saying what I'm doing in my restaurant, but that's what happens.
Mhm.
But if you were to flip that and then say, actually, I'm going to list, an incredible champagne on my list for £70, that cost me 30 to buy it.
Mhm.
You just see it's barely like 2x there,
Mhm.
but you're still making £40, which is more than what you would made on that cheapest bottle. And if you're
Mhm.
a discerning consumer and you want to have a good experience, you're just like, well, I'm not going to buy the 40 quid. Like I'm going to spend 60 on it. And maybe I'm
Right.
comfortable spending the 70
Right.
because I don't feel like I'm being fleeced.
Right. Right. Right.
And
It
that then
influences
better.
behavior.
Yes. And I think it makes a huge difference. That's why you
Mm.
actually sell better, people drink better, they have a much better experience, and it's a
Mhm.
win-win. So I think in this instance, I'm like, you know what? Yes, there's margins, and then yes, you can throw math at me, but you forget that there is, food and drink is about the ultimate experience.
Mhm.
Catch that it's not just about this industry. I'm a marketer by trade, right? You look at consumer marketing anywhere. It's always about what is the end consumer experience and how people will spend. Like, what's the value that you're getting? When you're looking at a wine list, you're not thinking about things like, don't want the cheapest, don't want the most expensive, because I think I'm getting fleeced on those things. That's not the thought you want to be having. You
Mm.
want to be kind of looking at it and sort of going, what do I feel like drinking today and what's my budget?
Mhm, mhm.
That's the conversation you need to be having with yourself. My budget is, I'm willing to spend about 50 quid or 60
Right.
quid or 40 quid, whatever the case might be. What's my best bet on this list that works in the flavor profile that I want?
Mhm, mhm. It's fascinating. I love it. So I'm curious about something. So, of course, I'm going to stick with wines for a moment, but I do have a couple questions on spirits. But
Mhm.
when it comes to, because of course, in the last 10 years or so, maybe a little bit more,
Yeah.
bioproduced wines have come to play. And I'm just curious, how is that reflected in the pricing? And, what's the real difference there? Is it more a perceived value or is there actually something else going on there?
Well, it is, to be fair, it is a little bit more expensive to produce. Now,
Mhm,
when you talk about bio, there are so many terms that throw around in the wine area that I think, do a person's head in. I actually had to do my diploma thesis on
mhm.
certifications. Can you imagine? For just one region, which is Bordeaux, never mind where
Right.
else. It's insane. But if
Mhm,
I combine them together and I talk about, let's say organic and overarchingly, bio or sustainable practices, as it were. What
mhm,
this basically means is, again, going back to the agricultural behavior of, how organic kind of came into eating produce, which was, let's stop throwing chemicals into everything just to kind of create more volume, more volume, more volume, more volume.
mhm,
So if you're creating better quality, so you're using less chemicals, so, yes, you save money on, okay, not spending on using a lot of chemicals, but by and large, when you look at a lot of wine regions, they're beset with all the problems that's happening with the, global climate change. And then you look at regions like Bordeaux, which are wet and humid and, weirdly cold, and there's a lot of pest and disease pressure. That
mhm.
kind of automatically will mean there will be a settling time when your yields are going to contract.
Right.
When your yields contract, lower volume, that means you have less wine to sell. The
Mhm.
quality will be higher, but you have less wine to sell.
Right.
So therefore, it's a bit more expensive,
Right.
but you drink better. So, there, and it will balance out ultimately at some
Mhm,
point. But I think by and large, it's definitely costs a little bit more because
mhm,
along with it's not just the lack of chemicals,
mhm,
but generally people who talk about sustainability, who talk about, all of these certifications, it goes beyond, it goes into the process, it goes into how you're treating your people, it goes into, is there sort of, fair working conditions, etc. So,
mhm.
it's about, you're not running a sweatshop. So
Right.
it's when you're not kind of doing that, that's, where the cost sort of comes. So
Mhm.
there is a little bit of perception as well, because I think sometimes, you could be drinking something and you're like, oh my God, this like tastes like 50 shades of apple cider. And after a while, you're like, okay, put something in it to stabilize it. But I
Right.
think there is a thoughtfulness in giving back to the
Mhm,
soil. There's a thoughtfulness in how we are sort of doing our practices. But
mhm.
there is a reflection in the price. It's the same as how it is with a lot of
It is.
produce.
Okay.
But I wouldn't get hung up on the word organic. I
Mm,
think we
mhm.
need to be a bit more conscious and use
Yeah.
sustainability, because a
Mhm,
lot, and this also happens with food, you can
mhm.
get a lot.
Yeah.
But I will give you the example of a couple of regions in the world where they have a natural advantage,
Mhm.
climatic conditions, where sustainability is much easier. I think New Zealand wins hands down. Like, it's
Mm.
a blessed country, right? It is paradise on earth. And even as when you're studying wine, you're sort of going, oh my God, like they've got every climatic advantage you can imagine. They get the sun, but they kind of get the winds, they get the coolness, they get the rightness, they get all of it. But
Right.
by and large, pretty much everything that's produced in New Zealand is, they have a benchmark.
Mhm,
You will never find New Zealand wines too expensive. You'll never find them too cheap.
mhm.
But you will always have a quality consistency when you buy it, because
Mm.
of just the general sort of ethos in the country and their natural advantages. But that is, I think, possibly a good benchmark to sort of then look from when you're looking at where can I have quality wines that have been made with a relative level of ethos and kind
Mhm.
of, so everyone in the world is doing that, including in the UK.
Yeah.
But yes, there is, it's hard to sort of find organic, biodynamic, sustainably made wines at 5.99 a
Yeah,
bottle.
it's almost impossible, right? You probably wouldn't want to, right? Because
No, no,
yeah,
I don't know what we're putting in our body, so
yeah.
I really would not recommend it.
Okay. So now, is there a difference then in sort of this overview of how you price a wine versus how you price spirits?
Um, yes, with spirits, it's actually gets there are many things, there's certain similar factors, but unlike grapes, which is a fruit, and yield is a really huge part of it.
Mhm.
With spirits, it's primarily made from grain, and obviously there's cognac and things, but it uses brandy, it uses pomace, it doesn't use fresh grapes. With spirits, the biggest differential is
Mhm.
between large volume production and smaller batch craft, the word sort of artisanal, as it were. Now, for example, and I hope the folks at Diageo don't shoot me for this, but a Johnny Walker Black is a really well-made blended whiskey. They, don't cut corners. It's very well made, but it
Mhm.
costs, I think, about 40 or 50p a bottle, the liquid inside it, just
Mhm.
because of the sheer volume. They own the global chain,
Mhm.
because you are able to recoup back the cost or you put in the initial investments. The investments in distilling spirits, initial investment is huge, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Got your stills, you sort of got to have the right hygiene, storage factors, all of that. But if you're able to make enough and you're able to find a market for it, you make your
Mhm.
money on the volume.
Mhm.
Whereas when you're looking at smaller producers, it just becomes XXX more. It's just because of the the economies of scale there.
Mhm.
And things that, again, you can't get the same discounts that you would when you're buying a barrel versus somebody who's buying, I need to buy 3 barrels versus somebody who's like, I'm buying 50,000 barrels a year, or
Mhm.
I'm making 50,000 bottles versus I'm going to make 3,000 bottles. So there's a
Right.
huge cost
Okay.
differential there.
Yeah.
Then the other really big thing about spirits is when you go away, there's a standard, right? So most gins, on the premium end will kind of cost you anything in the 30s to 40s in the UK. Like, it's a standard. Maso
Mhm.
Menos, like, a few pounds here or there.
Mhm.
Whereas with wine, it can vary, massively. Um, but then when you start getting into collectors type stuff, there is a very
Mhm.
significant difference there. It's because of the aging process. So for spirits, aging
Ah,
is the biggest thing, especially with whiskeys. So,
okay.
is it barrel aged? Which is why gin, with very few exceptions, you don't find them in, like, psychotic premium categories. But whiskeys and things that you
Yeah,
age, it's that
it's
because
true.
of the high alcohol
Yeah.
content, first of all, there's a huge evaporation loss. So the hotter the country, the more it, of the angel's share.
Mhm.
And how long are you aging it for? What's the quality of the barrels? And then also, like, on the prestige and the dramatic nature of the bottles, like, we're
Mhm.
talking Baccarat crystal, we're talking all of this. So whereas with wine, at the end of the day, even the most expensive bottles would be costing, like, a certain amount. Here, just the container of the spirit can get into, like, ludicrous amounts. So
Mhm. Mhm.
spirits have a lot more consistency in pricing.
Mhm.
You start to really get into, collector stuff. But even there, I think spirits is a lot more consistently priced
Mhm.
than wine.
In the mind. Yeah.
And it also suffers less from, the vagaries of nature and, vintage variation year on year. So,
Hmm, that's true.
releases in
Yeah.
2022, very expensive because in certain countries, because they had massive fires, so they
Mhm.
lost about 50% of the production. We keep hearing about hail when the vines are very tender. It,
Right.
when that happens in spring, they don't just lose crop from that year, because
No,
there are
they
buds that are gonna, open the following year. You lose crop for a number of years.
Mhm.
That variation is less dramatic in spirits
Right.
because you're aging them, you're releasing them, you're sort of blending them. It's,
Mhm.
there is a lot more consistency, so you can
Mhm.
balance itself out. So just, and that's why so many people are getting back into the distillery game, simply because the distiller's margin is
Yeah.
much higher than what a winemaker's margin is, unless you're a
Mhm.
Mouton Rothschild.
Right, right. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, never seen. I haven't been around that long, but it was really obvious when all of these like micro producers of gin started because there's just gin everywhere,
I
right?
mean, I can make
I
some in
think
my
it's
own home.
probably one of the easier ones to produce, which is
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
why people
Because
would
you
go
just
there
work
too.
with a good neutral spirit, then you decide
Yeah.
you can buy mini, distillation things. I mean, COVID
Mhm.
was so many people turned into gin producers in a way. Okay, I'm doing. It's a really fascinating world. There's like so much
Yeah.
magic. There's a lot of innovation in the world of spirits that's happening, which I think is
Mhm.
really quite fantastic. It's able to be a lot more agile
Mhm.
than wine. Um, but yeah, I think with spirits, without question, there's a lot more consistency in
Mm.
pricing and quality.
I had to laugh because last year I was at a Christmas market in Freiburg, Germany, and I ran across this stand that had moonshine. And as an American, so I live in Switzerland. For anybody who's watching doesn't know that, I was like, they're selling moonshine in Germany, and it was really lovely, I have to say.
You can have some. But all of this home distillation stuff is moonshine. There's another magic. Like today, I mean, of course, you can do this with wine as well.
Right.
But the world is shifting so much. Like, when you talk about investment, like people used to talk about wine collections, right?
Right.
Whiskey casks today are an even more stable investment. Because if you get the right product, and again, people keep talking about rum, but we will see where rum goes unless you're buying something from a distillery that's completely closed. It can never be produced again. Then basically you can like command stupid amounts of money at auction. Like, Bowmore released a 38 year
Right.
old whiskey that got into a bidding war and sold for 500,000, like
Mhm.
a bottle. Um, but you can, so for example, with one of my private clients, they're going to be buying a cask of whiskey and they want it for the long term. So by the time, and I'm going to probably buy them something that's currently about sort of, 8 years of age,
Mhm.
because by the time they will want to, either dispose of it or they want to actually partially bottle some for their friends at that point, it's
Mhm.
going to be 18 years old.
Wow.
And the storage costs, yes, they're expensive, but the exponential value of that whiskey at that
Mhm.
point would be phenomenal. And then this person is going to be having this amazing, personalized bottling
Right.
that they're going to be giving out to their, friends as a big major celebration. So I think that there's something quite
Mhm.
remarkable about that.
Mhm.
People do
That's
this with
very
wine as
interesting.
well, but with spirits, I think it's
It's a little harder.
yeah. And
Mm.
also, I think it's interesting that for the first time in the history of time, spirit sales have overtaken wine sales in the US.
Hmm. Is that a good thing or a bad thing or just an interesting thing?
Interesting things, because wine is going through a bad time. I think global,
Mhm.
climate change is destroying a
Mm.
huge amount. Yields are getting unpredictable. Small HEA prices are going through the roof. People are earning a
Mhm.
lot less because of all of the, the global drama that's kind of going on. We're all aware
Mhm.
of it. So it's kind of becoming a little bit more unwieldy. I
Right.
think the other thing that we also forget with wine is you can't just buy a great bottle of wine and just store it anyhow and think, it's going to hold itself
Mhm.
together. Like, it's a fragile item.
Right.
The more expensive wine is, the better you want to store it. So even when you sort of look at countries like India and everything, and people are like, oh, the wine scene, and I'm like, yes, it's burgeoning, but with that, you also need to have the infrastructure,
Right.
right? Spirits are not going to die. You keep it out of the, direct light. But if I stick a bottle of spirit, in a cupboard in India at 40 degrees centigrade heat, I don't know how
Mhm.
that converts in American Fahrenheit, but
That's fine.
40, 50 C,
Mhm.
it's fine. My
Right.
wine is going to turn into Madeira. So,
Right.
so you need to invest in like a wine fridge. So it's kind of like, it's
Yeah.
insane. It's there's a
Insane.
lot of
Mhm.
costs
Yeah.
involved, and lots of sort of duty and regulations. And
Mhm. Mhm.
alcohol is a different difficult industry to price
Right.
smartly.
So, Ruchira, if someone out there listening is
Mhm.
starting a business in the food and beverage or the wine and spirits area, and they need to go about pricing their wine or the spirits for that, what tips do you have for them?
I think let's start with what it actually costs them to make,
Mm-hmm.
and then the quality of the product, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, and then I think if it's of a particular ilk, it's worth an understanding what's the right market for you. Because
Mm.
you make a great product, for example, but it literally costs you, and I'm going to use loose numbers to run the math on it. It costs you £20 to make this beautiful wine, and you're like, but I really want to get into the UK, and you're making it, let's say, in I don't know, Spain or South Africa or something, or
Mm-hmm.
even England actually, and then you sort of go, UK is a very price sensitive market.
Mm-hmm.
So are you going to do a pricing war to try and sort of, get into this here, or you go find yourself a different market for it?
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing is, what is it that you want to do in this industry, right? There's so many different variations that you can do, whether you kind of come in as a consultant, you want to be a sommelier, you want to understand wine. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's really important kind of doing the certifications, but when you're pricing a product, it's just be realistic with the market that you want to sell in, and then work backwards from there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you might find that producing a wine in the UK is not the right thing for you. You really want to produce today. If I wanted to produce, I would possibly, and I wanted to sell in the UK until I build my brand, I would produce it elsewhere.
Mhm, mhm, yeah. Well, that's one of the things I preach to everybody out there is that, starting with who you're targeting
Exactly.
answers a lot of the pricing questions that you have along the way. Not all of them, but many of them. So that's always a good place to start. One last question before we start wrapping this up, which is what tips do you have for consumers when they're buying wine and spirits?
Okay, couple of things. If you're in a restaurant, the
Mhm,
sommelier is your friend.
okay.
Don't be afraid. If they've got a sommelier, their job there is to help you.
Mhm,
Start with, this is how much I want to spend. What's your best bet? And these are kind of the tastes I'm looking for.
mhm,
They will do a good job for you.
okay.
If you're in a supermarket or you're looking for wine to buy, or you're in a wine shop or whatever, online, as the case might be, let's going back to the original example we were talking about, that anything between sort of, and especially for the UK, between £8 and £20, every extra pound you spend goes towards the quality of wine in your bottle.
Mhm,
Think about that, when you're looking at it, and consider three regions of the world for consistency and quality: South Africa, New Zealand, and to a huge extent, Southern Rhone. They've got
okay.
great, climatic benefits.
Mhm,
And Haute Rhone is doing a great job. Like I visited them last week.
mhm.
Um, so, that is something to kind of bear in mind. But those are the main things that I would say.
Okay, super. Those are great tips. I look forward to putting them into use. So, if there's one thing that you'd like people to remember from our conversation today when it comes to pricing in the wine and spirits industries, what is it that they should take away?
You know what? Don't get hung up on what everybody does with pricing. Be bold, understand your industry, work
Mhm,
backwards. I think be bold with your pricing choices. They will surprise you. Like, I was a
mhm,
newcomer in this industry, and within 6 weeks of launching a restaurant drinks list, beverage sales went from 10% of total sales to 30%. The accountant is calling the restaurant owner going, have you stopped paying your invoices? Like, why are you making so much money on beverage sales? So, I just used a different approach. I think
right.
there's just, don't be afraid to break the
Mhm,
norm.
okay. Are there any books or tools that you'd recommend for people?
Pricing strategy. I think, Janine, you're
Yeah.
probably better on that one. I think
Okay.
I'm going to go with something. We all need a little bit of light humor in our lives. So for me,
Mhm.
a tool that kind of calms me down is the humor of PG Woodhouse. He's one of the most entertaining, right? It's fictional
Okay.
work. It's one of the most entertaining writer of the last century, and just so comical. It just really relaxes me. So
Yeah, okay. We'll
not
have to I'll
necessarily
have to get the spelling of the name for you so we can put a link into the show notes.
Woodhouse, yes.
Yeah. Cool. So,
You-
Ruchira, if someone would like to talk to you about how to price what they're doing or how to select the right wines for their restaurant or location, where's the best place for them to reach out to you?
Uh, I would suggest, reach out to me either on my LinkedIn or actually my Instagram. So
Okay.
just contact me on my
Yeah.
Instagram. Yeah.
So we'll put both those links in the show notes as well so people can reach out and talk to you. Ruchira, this has been really insightful. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It was my pleasure. This was so much fun. I hope there was something useful in here for you, but
I found it super interesting. Like I said, I mean, I have a previous life kind of in the agriculture side of things, so I was already fascinated and interested.
Mhm.
But I know there's a lot of gaps in that, and I love putting a different spin on the topic.
Yeah,
So I very much appreciate. Thank you so much for being here.
it is my pleasure. And actually, if I may, just one
Mhm.
last thing, I would probably
Okay.
say the one thing I think when considering the drinks industry and considering pricing is to really sort of map it with a marketing strategy.
Mm,
Because nowhere in any industry does brand and marketing have a greater impact on the overarching price that you can command for your product than this industry.
mhm. Super. Great way to wrap that up. So, thank you to all of you who are out there listening. We appreciate having you here with us today. One more thing before you go, if you're curious about how to set prices in your business, then head on over to thepricinglady.com, set my prices, and check out the next cohort of the Fair Price Formula. That's all for today, everyone. I wish you all the best, and as always, enjoy pricing.
Bye.